So today on my little corner of the pie, I'm talking, well, let's take a step back. Let's look at like all of Magic and let's imagine a world without the reserve list. What cards would you put on? What cards would you put off? For me personally, I would take off obviously the 10 OG duels because they're kind of needed for like high level play, especially in kind of the more interesting formats, in the form of Legacy and Vintage. Uh, and I know all the CDH players are going to be like, well, what about CDH? It's like, you get enough stuff. So let the Legacy and Vintage players have something for a change. Um, but yeah, those would be my like personal like things I would take off. But let's be more realistic. If we were Wizards and we were looking at the reserve list, what would we take off that would provide the most value to us and the least potential for someone to get mad at us? Well, I think Undiscovered Paradise is definitely something that could come off. It's a $10 card, I think, at the most, and it's just a simple land that taps for one of any color and then bounces itself. It's not going to make anything better by people having more access to it. It's just a funny little land that can kind of just go in every precon and essentially just does whatever. So that would be my honest answer. Another honest answer would probably be something like Allurin. 4-mana enchantment gives creatures flash that have 3 or less, and you may cast them for free. Any player. Those types of cards, I'm always of the mindset that they can kind of just come off whenever because they're not going to really be powering up a bunch of decks, and the decks that kind of run them already run them anyway, so reprinting them doesn't really affect the collecting value of them unless it's for the art, but we've kind of seen over time that like the prices stabilize anyways, even with like minor dips. So that's kind of what it is. But let's actually kind of talk about moving forward. Let's talk about how the reserve list has kind of affected the game and like what it looks like. For me, as someone who really likes the game and likes playing at higher power levels and playing good cards, it's affected me, but it also hasn't, because for a lot of it, you don't really need a lot of the reserve list cards, minus maybe a couple, because a lot of them just aren't good or utility wise. They've been power crept out of the game to oblivion. I'm looking at you, Yawgmoth's Will and Underworld Breach. Well, Underworld Breach pushing Yawgmoth's Will out of the format and stuff like its ilk. There was that weird bird that was better Stormcrow or Rock, whatever that bird was, that came out in Innistrad, and so people have been like talking about it ever since. And so the thought process is, I understand that they're worried about collector's values, but you also have to take into consideration these are game pieces, and game pieces ultimately are going to need to be played. Otherwise, they have no value. Minus the collecting part, but even then, like, I don't really see a lot of people collecting these things except for like super collectors or legacy vintage players. But at this point, there's not a legacy vintage scene mostly anywhere, but neither here nor there. So ultimately, what this kind of ends up being is we're always stuck in the same loop of like, abolish the reserve list, rebolish the reserve list, or add more stuff to it. And ultimately, I think that's not the good conversation to be having about it. The conversation we should be having with Wizards is, well, if you aren't going to abolish the reserve list, can you at least make formats that we can play cards in at least more accessible? And so what does accessibility look like, and having a deep conversation with Wizards about that? Because a lot of people just aren't. And I know this is no roughs and feathers, but it's like, well, they say the fetch line shouldn't be reprinted in any standard set ever again. I'm not of that mindset because I believe that every color should have access to the fetch lines at any given point, especially in all formats. Not because they're insanely powerful or insanely weak. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think it just is a weird way to gatekeep the game from people who want to like play at a more competitive power level that's completely needless. It's not like you're gatekeeping things that people can't play with for like specific formats. Like we have commander precons every single set now. But they never really kind of cross into like really good territory. I mean, they don't really get like the real good reprints. We just had Commander Masters, and I don't need to bash on Wizards for how that went down. That's not what this channel's for. What I would like to say is there's definitely room for improvements and where those improvements lie. You can make a mana base be consistent and good, but not have it be overwhelming. So for example, if you want to start printing reprinting powerful cards like fetch lands and OG duels, just make sure they can't whatever the term is for parasitism in sets. I don't actually know the word, but it's essentially parasiting off of each other. So if you're printing the fetch lands into a standard rotation, don't print fetchable duels or tries in that rotation. And then when they're out of rotation, you can print stuff like shocklands, and the fetchable stuff like shocklands, the snow duels from Kaldheim, the triumphs outside of those standard sets. Now, I also know that Wizards is kind of off the printing shocklands for a while, but I just don't think that's a good idea because they're just going to creep up in price, and then we're just going to get to this point where the game's too expensive to play for everyone. And so the only people who are playing are whales, proxiers, or people who just have these cards over time, and makes it very hard to recommend this game to other people in your same tax bracket as someone who's been playing for a while. I got in when the game was kind of really cheap too, relatively speaking. And so watching the prices fluctuate has been a very interesting thing. So ultimately, I'm going to wrap this up by saying the RC or the reserve list is a very moot point if the game is unplayable in terms of at any power level. So we really need to have a conversation in terms of like, what is a power level? What is the power level we want things to be at consistently, and setting the power level at that and having cards accessibly in that power level? It seems like Wizards is kind of going for a mid-rangey grindcore / like punch out power level. So a lot of their decks reflect that, but it kind of leaves out other players and other people who like different things. So I think they should at least be slightly more open to like considering other players, because they definitely consider the punchy players definitely more so than anything in the commander players. But I mean, hey, do what makes money. And that's what they're doing. They're following the cash. So that's going to be it off my little soapbox. This has been BDK. Have a good night.